A Festschrift. It's an honorable and venerable tradition to honor scholars, colleagues, and teachers with a celebratory book, a Festschrift, from the German origin of that term. And we're here to announce the process and the publication of a Festschrift in honor of our dear colleague, Dr. James W. Voelz. I'm Andy Bartelt with another colleague, Paul Robbie, and we were very much involved along with Jeff Kloa, who cannot be with us at this moment, to edit the press of the text. Thank you, Paul. The press of the text, Biblical Studies in honor of James W. Voelz. Paul, give us a little background on how we came to this time and place. The occasion was actually the 70th birthday, which for our colleague Jim was in 2015. Here we are 2 years later, and in the larger course of things, that's actually a pretty good time frame for moving from inception and conception to the actual birth of this book, which is really just out in the last couple of months.
Well, and it's published by Wipfenstock, 2017.
Yeah. Yeah, let's put in a little
We're
plug.
Happy that they were
available
willing to
at
publish
Amazon,
it,
right?
and they gave it this nice cover with a copy of a manuscript. Well, we conceived it about 3 years ago or so. We brainstormed together with Jeff Kloa that we should honor Jim Voelz with some type of volume, and so we started brainstorming what names would be good to include. A volume of this sort necessarily is a collection of essays by different scholars on a wide variety of topics. Basically, each one's allowed to write on whatever he wants to write about. So it's a collection of mostly New Testament essays, but also a couple Old Testament essays and some on textual criticism as well.
In fact, one of the, I think, noteworthy observations about this particular Festschrift, and it is in specific recognition of Jim's, Dr. Voelz's breadth and depth of scholarship, that we have this wide spectrum. We actually had to be somewhat selective in narrowing down the number of essays that could be there, especially amongst our own colleagues. There are really only 4 of us from the faculty that are represented here, but we wanted to note the various associations that Jim has participated in through his scholarly activities. And maybe, Jim, you could chime in, just you know these people. I think Paul and I and Jeff Kloa would certainly attest to the fact that this was a lot of just fun to get to know and to read some of this material.
It's absolutely amazing. I was impressed with the breadth of the contributors. Mm-hmm. As you say, lots of New Testament people. You guys had these great dynamite Old Testament essays. But then some of my colleagues from scholarly societies who are in areas that you and I don't normally work in.
Correct. Mm-hmm.
So you have, for example, Gary Phillips is a really good example. Teaches in a small college in Indiana, does very cutting-edge sort of hermeneutic stuff. He's been a guest professor here.
You've had him for your graduate course, right?
Yeah, I've had him for a graduate course. Kind of become a friend of the seminary, you know. So that was great to have something by him. Jesus Pelaez from Cordoba in Spain. He is the chief editor of the new, and this is quite a groundbreaking work, the new Greek-Spanish lexicon. Well, his essay is this heavy lexicographical thing, which was great. I mean, it's really something. But then, well, I don't know which of you was responsible for the Mike Middendorf thing, but that was great. One of my former students, New Testament, who has this wonderful essay on the analogy between the World Series and the Christian life. And this is, you guys always...
Veltzian.
Yeah, analogies all over the place. Yeah, that's exactly right. I really appreciated that you had Chris Karagunas, native of Athens, teaches, he's retired now, but at the University of Lund in Sweden, and Chris is, well, simply a world authority on the Greek language. And he and I, for many years now, well, he just kind of retired from this, have been co-chair of the Greek language seminar of the International New Testament Society. And Chris knows forgotten more about Greek any of us have ever known. So
Bernard Ladahan.
Well, Bernard, let's talk about Bernard Ladahan. Bernard's down in South Africa, and at Stellenbosch, right outside of Cape Town. Now, Bernard's a name none of the people in our circles particularly know, except that he's been on campus to teach.
He's taught a couple times.
But I mean, Bernard is a guy who has applied principles of biblical interpretation across the spectrum, also to the things that happened in South Africa at the transition from the de Klerk white regime to what happened with Nelson Mandela, 1994. And Bernard was instrumental in the reconciliation process.
Right, he was
down there.
a major figure.
Major figure.
In that
so to have someone like that, I mean, is just absolutely fantastic, and I can't thank you enough.
And
you know, when we're talking
Reinsdorf.
about, we're talking about South Africa, a couple of more in there. Dieter Reinsdorf, who's the head of a church that we're in fellowship down there, Felsisa. A very interesting scholar who's been able to take pretty high New Testament scholarship into the leadership of the church down there. And then Gerald West. Gerald West is about as out there guy as you could ask for, but a man he's an Anglican, who has put his faith on the line in the context of South Africa. This is a man who reads the Bible with AIDS patients out in the bush, and knows what it's like to interpret the Bible in context that the rest of us, myself included, would find very uncomfortable.
Right.
And also another name is Keith Elliot. And I wanted to just read what he said in the introduction of his
this is
essay.
pretty funny.
So who is Keith Elliot? Remind our listeners.
Keith Elliott's the doctor father of Jeff Kloa.
Right.
And a friend of mine from the International New Testament Society, and probably the greatest text critic in the world right now. So, go ahead.
Well, it has been a pleasure for me to be Jim's guest twice at his Al Saad Concordia Seminary. I well recall one occasion when he took my wife and me to the ballpark to watch a game, where the St. Louis Cardinals were playing the Arizona Diamondbacks, during which he attempted to explain to me the intricacies of the action, utilizing analogies from cricket.
Yeah.
And we had a great time.
Thoroughly
doing
believable.
Yeah.
Keith Elliot is a New Testament textual critic.
Yeah.
Right.
And again, his article is very scholarly and technical. So is Jeff Kloa's, for that matter, following along in the same discipline. Well, I mean, what did we added up? 20 scholars from 7 different countries, I think, if I remember correctly. And the diversity. This is part of, I guess, my own tribute to you, Jim. That
before you go on, let me just mention one that you included. I was really thankful for, Larry Brennan.
Yes.
Let me just talk about that.
That's another good example.
Because Larry Brennan is very important for this volume. Larry Brennan was for many years the academic dean at Kenrick Seminary here in St. Louis. That's the Roman Catholic Diocesan Seminary. And he was really the leader for well over a decade of Lutheran Catholic dialogue between their seminary and our Concordia Seminary, St. Louis. Larry was very important with this and has really been able to kind of understand Lutheranism and give us understanding of Roman Catholicism. And his essay is just a wonderful essay of the church and state and so on.
Yeah, it was very, very good.
Yeah.
And he's just a very thoughtful guy. And we've had this wonderful relationship with him.
Yeah.
And then also with Kenrick.
With Kenrick, yes.
And you've been a key part of that. That was the point I was going to make, Jim, is that you you are just naturally a curious person in the most positive sense of the term. You want to understand more things and see how things work and take them apart and put them back together again. That goes from physical objects to deep thinking. But you've challenged us all in many ways, not only to apply that curiosity and intellectual inquiry, but one always grounded in our understanding of biblical faith and our life as servants of our Lord and His church. Yet, you've pushed us out of those shells, and you've opened conversations with a lot of people that you just described that otherwise I think people in our circles wouldn't know or wouldn't interact with. And that sort of intellectual courage, sort of formed by the convictions that we have, that enables us to do that without fear. A lot of people are just plain afraid of interacting.
And to interact with the thoughts and work that's going on today,
correct.
rather than only repristinate yesterday.
Yeah, it's
and
talking
so
about our same issues
and
again
especially
and
in hermeneutics, you really brought great energy and vitality to that whole discussion on how do you read a text and what's going on when you're reading it. I mean, this has just been terrific. I remember years ago when we had these Friday sessions where a bunch of profs would gather together and we'd have wine and cheese, and Jim would make sure we always had nice wine. And then different people would give a paper, and then all of the profs would kind of chime in and debate and discuss and go back and forth on the ins and outs of the paper. And that was such a mind-expanding experience for me. I just am so thankful for being a colleague of yours, Jim, on the faculty. And those Friday sessions were just so beneficial.
Well, I have to thank you guys for that kind of support. Now we talked about a few of these South Africans like Bernard, Gerald West, and Gary Phillips, the guy from Indiana. These are, well, Andy, I don't know what we'd say. You can talk about cutting edge. They're sort of beyond cutting edge in some respects. But, Gary was on our campus as a guest in one of my grad hermeneutics courses recently, and was relating, just to kind of put a little flesh on the bones here of what you're talking about, was relating biblical interpretation to how we interpret art. And that was really, he was using the art of Samuel Bach, who is a guy who paints paintings to express what people have experienced in the Holocaust. And it's
well, that's his article in here.
Exactly.
Interacts with that, right?
And that is it challenges all of us. That's what it has to do. But I love the title, and I just got to thank you guys for the title, The Press of the Text, because your point now about grounded. I mean, we can talk all we want about stuff on the margins, but finally you're grounded, and the text makes you obedient to the promises of God. That's
right.
That's the press of the text.
Yeah. This is one of your favorite terms that you used, and that's why it came to our mind.
And seeing the text over us and imposing itself on us and shaping the way we think rather than we're over the text playing games with it and doing with it what we want to do with it.
Well, no, that last point you were making there, we've certainly experienced that enough in the Society of Biblical Literature, right? Where you're playing games with the text. Well, this chapter will move that around. These verses don't fit, stuff like that.
It's a toy, and we'll play with it.
Yeah. And finally, at some point, you have to be obedient to the text, and the text, now what I'm going to say here I think is good Lutheran way to put it. The text addresses us.
Right.
That's the thing. It addresses us. Bernard Lottahan often talks like that. The text addresses us, and it is not, Paul, to use your term, just this toy that we play and fool around with. This is true of any text in a way, but how much more so for the Holy Scriptures.
And one thing that you've always emphasized, and we emphasize here, is, and that means going back to the original Hebrew and Greek, and not just working with the English. And you
Yes.
have really stressed that well, that we have to plow through the Greek, and there's just no way around it.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, the people watching this should know you have Greek teacher, Hebrew teacher,
Yeah.
Hebrew teacher. There is a discipline, isn't there, about dealing with the language on the most basic level, where you can't kind of negotiate with it. You're working with the forms, with the constructions and so on like that. And in general, wouldn't you say that you found this from like SPL? The more liberal people become, generally, the less connected to the specificities
Right,
of the
right.
text they are.
Well, they're limitations. They're actually marks on the page,
Yes.
as you like to say. That's
Yeah.
part of the press of the text.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's not nice pun here on a publication that's now
Yeah.
no longer in press, but is actually here. But they're marks on the page, and you have to deal with them. You can't
Exactly.
rearrange them. You can't add or subtract.
Yeah.
And that's the limitation on us as servants of that text.
Yeah.
And Jim, you are currently demonstrating how this works with your commentaries on Mark. And Jim has one volume out on Mark already, and he's currently writing the second volume in the Concordia Commentary series.
And I'm happy to tell you, Paul, I work about 5 to 6 hours a day on it.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you what we're talking about right now is being shown in spades in what I'm doing. I sit in the library, you look in the dictionary for something, you realize, I didn't know that meaning was there.
Yeah, right.
Does that fit here?
Yeah, right. You're actually
And
right, find stuff.
I hate to sort of promote you guys for the Old Testament, but you talk about the press of the text, working in the latter portion of Isaiah. You're wondering, well, how does that chapter fit? And then, if it ever flits into your mind, maybe this is out of place, and you say, no, let the press of the text
It's
control
there,
us
right,
here. It's
right.
there.
Yeah, right,
It's there.
right,
yeah.
right. Well, before we run out of time,
Yeah.
I'm actually just going to read the names. So
Okay.
For some of the people watching this, and we certainly want to encourage you to get the volume and read it yourself. But we have Charles Arend, a colleague with
Yep.
us on the faculty. Paul and myself and Jeff Kloa have an article. Then Larry Brennan, you mentioned,
Yeah.
from Kenrick Seminary. Chris Karagunis.
Yep.
Keith Elliot, you talked about. Charles Gieshen, currently the academic dean, but a New Testament scholar at our sister seminary in
One
Fort
of my
Wayne.
students from Fort Wayne.
And he was,
right?
he was a student.
yep.
David Hasselbrook, David was one of your doctoral students.
Yes.
And he's done continuing work in lexicography,
Right.
correct?
Right.
Bernard Lodahan we discussed, Mike Mittendorf, who is now teaching
Yeah.
at Concordia Irvine.
Irvine.
Jesus Pelez, Gary Phillips, Dieter Reinstorff, we talked about. Voelz and Schultz we hadn't mentioned.
Well, there's
from
one of my,
Brazil.
yes,
Yeah.
there's
From
one of my
Brazil.
graduate students, and he is a big gun, actually, in the United Bible Societies. He's the
right.
chief of the Brazil Bible Society, the translation side of it.
Mark Seifert, now from our faculty as
Right.
well. William Weinrich, Bill Weinrich, a dear colleague and friend
Yep.
going back for most of your life
Fort
together.
Wayne.
And then Gerald West. Oh, and Tom Winger, who's
Tom
the
Winger,
president
another one
of
of
the
my-
Concordia St. Catherine's Seminary.
right, one of my
Lutheran Church in
PhD
Canada. But he
students.
was a PhD student
What
as
a
well.
wonderful article.
We have a tribute written by Jack Dean Kingsbury,
Yeah.
who's become a dear, dear friend. And by the way, you are the holder of the Jack D. Kingsbury Professorship and
Right.
Chair in New Testament Studies. So he wrote a tribute, and then we have, it was fun for us to put together some reminiscences as well. And we have at least an abbreviated bibliography in
Yeah.
the back.
No,
So
this
those
is
are
really
the
good.
traditional pieces in a festschrift. The press of the text, it is an impressive volume.
Well, thank you. I couldn't be more honored. It's just fantastic.
It's
And
been
thank
a
you
lot of
for
fun for
your
us.
friendship and being a colleague, and this has just been a wonderful time.